The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. A considerable number of hunting parties were out that year, without finding so much as a fresh trail. For the moose were uncommonly shy, and the various Nimrods returned to the bosoms of their respective families with the best excuses the facts of their imaginations could suggest. Dr. Cathart, among others, came back without a trophy, but he brought instead the memory of an experience which he declares was worth all the bull moose that had ever been shot. But then Cathart of Aberdeen was interested in other things besides moose, amongst them the vagaries of the human mind. This particular story, however, found no mention in his book on collective hallucination for the simple reason, so he confided once to a fellow colleague that he himself played too intimate a part in it to form a competent judgment of the affair as a whole. Besides himself and his guide, Hank Davies, there was young Simpson, his nephew, a divinity student destined for the wee kirk, then on his first visit to Canadian backwoods, and the latter's guide, Defago. Joseph Defago was a French Canuck who had strayed from his native province of Quebec years before, and had got caught in Rat Portage when the Canadian Pacific Railway was a-building, a man who, in addition to his unparalleled knowledge of woodcraft and bush lore, could also sing the old voyager songs and tell a capital hunting yarn into the bargain. He was deeply susceptible, moreover, to that singular spell which the wilderness lays upon certain lonely natures, and he loved the wild solitude with a kind of romantic passion that amounted almost to an obsession. The life of the backwoods fascinated him, whence, doubtless, his surpassing efficiency in dealing with their mysteries. On this particular expedition, he was Hank's choice. Hank knew him and swore by him. He also swore at him, just as a pal might. And since he had a vocabulary of picturesque, if utterly meaningless oaths, the conversation between the two stalwart and hardy woodsmen was often of a rather lively description. This river of expletives, however, Hank agreed to dam a little out of respect for his old hunting boss, Dr. Cathart, whom of course he addressed after the fashion of the country as Doc, and also because he understood that young Simpson was already a bit of a parson. He had, however, one objection to Defago, and one only, which was that the French-Canadian sometimes exhibited what Hank described as the output of a cursed and dismal mind, meaning apparently that he sometimes was true to type, Latin type, and suffered fits of a kind of silent moroseness when nothing could induce him to utter speech. Defago, that is to say, was imaginative and melancholy, and as a rule it was too long a spell of civilization that induced the attacks, for a few days of the wilderness invariably cured them. This, then, was the party of four that found themselves in camp the last week in October of that shy moose year, way up in the wilderness north of Rat Portage, a forsaken and desolate country. There was also Punk, an Indian, who had accompanied Dr. Cathart and Hank on their hunting trips in previous years, and who acted as cook. His duty was merely to stay in camp, catch fish, and prepare venison steaks and coffee at a few minutes' notice. He dressed in the worn-out clothes bequeathed to him by former patrons, and, except for his coarse black hair and dark skin, he looked in these city garments no more like a real redskin than a stage Negro looks like a real African. For all that, however, Punk had in him still the instincts of his dying race. His taciturn silence and his endurance survived, also his superstition. The party round the blazing fire that night were despondent, for a week had passed without a single sign of recent moose discovering itself. Defago had sung his song and plunged into a story, but Hank, in bad humour, reminded him so often that he kept mussing up the facts so there was almost nothing but a petted-out lie, that the Frenchman had finally subsided into a sulky silence, which nothing seemed likely to break. Dr. Cathart and his nephew were fairly done after an exhausting day. Punk was washing up the dishes, grunting to himself under the lean-to of branches, where he later also slept. No one troubled to stir the slowly dying fire. Overhead, the stars were brilliant and the sky quite wintry, and there was so little wind that ice was already forming stealthily along the shores of the still lake behind them. The silence of the vast listening forest stole forward and enveloped them. Hank broke in suddenly with his nasal voice. "I'm in favour of breaking new ground tomorrow, Doc," he observed with energy, looking across at his employer. "We don't stand a dead Dago's chance around here." "Agreed," said Cathcart, always a man of few words. "Think the idea's good?" "Sure, Pop, it's good," Hank resumed with confidence. "Suppose now you and I strike up west, up Garden Lake way for a change. None of us ain't touched that quiet bit of land yet." "I'm with you." "And you, Fago, take Mr. Simpson along the small canoe. Skip across the lake, portage over into 50 Island water, and take a good squint down that southern shore. The moose yarded there like hell last year, and for all we know, they may be doing it again this year just to spite us." Fago, keeping his eye on the fire, said nothing by way of reply. He was still offended, possibly about his interrupted story. "No one's been up that way this year, and I'll lay my bottom dollar on that," Hank added with emphasis, as though he had a reason for knowing. He looked over at his partner sharply. "Better take the little silk tent and stay away a couple of nights," he concluded, as though the matter were definitely settled. For Hank was recognized as the general organizer of the hunt, and in charge of the party. It was obvious to anyone that Fago did not jump at the plan, but his silence seemed to convey something more than ordinary disapproval, and across his sensitive dark face there passed a curious expression like a flash of firelight. Not so quickly, however, that the three men had not time to catch it. "He funked for some reason, I thought," Simpson said afterwards in the tent he shared with his uncle. Dr. Cathcart made no immediate reply, although the look had interested him enough at the time for him to make a mental note of it. The expression had caused him a passing uneasiness he could not quite account for at the moment. But Hank, of course, had been the first to notice it, and the odd thing was that instead of becoming explosive or angry over the other's reluctance, he at once began to humour him a bit. "But there ain't no special reason why no one's been up there this year," he said with a perceptible hush in his tone. "Not the reason you mean, anyway. Last year was the fires that kept folks out, and this year I guess it just happened so, that's all." His manner was clearly meant to be encouraging. Joseph Fago raised his eyes a moment, then dropped them again. A breath of wind stole out of the forest and stirred the embers into a passing blaze. Dr. Cathcart again noticed the expression in the guy's face, and again he did not like it. But this time the nature of the look betrayed itself. In those eyes, for an instant, he caught the gleam of a man scared in his very soul. It disquieted him more than he cared to admit. "Bad Indians up that way?" he asked, with a laugh to ease matters a little, while Simpson, too sleepy to notice the subtle byplay, moved off to bed with a prodigious yawn. "Or anything wrong with the country?" he added, when his nephew was out of hearing. Hank met his eye with something less than his usual frankness. "He's just scared," he replied good-humouredly. "Scared stiff about some old fairy tale, that's all. Ain't it, old pard?" And he gave Fago a friendly kick in the moccasin boot that lay nearest the fire. Fago looked up quickly, as from an interrupted reverie. A reverie, however, that had not prevented his seeing all that went on about him. "Scared nothing," he answered, with a flush of defiance. "There's nothing in the bush that can scare Joseph Fago, and don't you forget it." And the natural energy with which he spoke made it impossible to know whether he told the whole truth or only a part of it. Hank turned towards the doctor. He was just going to add something when he stopped abruptly and looked around. A sound close behind them in the darkness made all three start. It was old Punk, who had moved up from his lean-to while they talked, and now stood there just beyond the circle of firelight, listening. "Another time, Doc," Hank whispered with a wink. When the gallery Hank stepped down into the doors, and, springing to his feet, he slapped the Indian on the back and cried noisily, "Come up to the fire and warm your dirty red skin a bit." He dragged him towards the blaze and threw more wood on. "That was a mighty good feed you gave us an hour or two back," he continued heartily, as though to set the man's thoughts on another scent. "And it ain't Christian to let you stand out there freezing your old soul to hell while we're getting all good and toasted." Punk moved in and warmed his feet, smiling darkly at the other's volubility, which he only half understood, but saying nothing. And presently Dr. Cathcart, seeing that further conversation was impossible, followed his nephew's example and moved off to the tent, leaving the three men smoking over the now blazing fire. It is not easy to undress in a small tent without waking one's companion, and Cathcart, heartened and warm-blooded as he was in spite of his 50-odd years, did what Hank would have described as considerable of his twilight in the open. He noticed, during the process, that Punk had meanwhile gone back to his lean-to, and that Hank and Defago were at it hammer and tongs, or rather hammer and anvil, the little French-Canadian being the anvil. It was all very like the conventional stage picture of Western melodrama, the fire lighting up their faces with patches of alternate red and black. Defago, in slouch hat and moccasins, in the part of the Badlands villain. Hank, open-faced and hatless, with that reckless fling of his shoulders, the honest and deceived hero. And old Punk, eavesdropping in the background, supplying the atmosphere of mystery. The doctor smiled as he noticed the details, but at the same time something deep within him, he hardly knew what, shrank a little, as though an almost imperceptible breath of warning had touched the surface of his soul, and was gone again before he could seize it. Probably it was traceable to that scared expression he had seen in the eyes of Defago. Probably, for this hint of fugitive emotion otherwise escaped his usually so keen analysis. Defago, who was vaguely aware, might cause trouble somehow. He was not as steady a guide as Hank, for instance. Further than that, he could not get... He watched the men a moment longer before diving into the stuffy tent, where Simpson already slept soundly. Hank, he saw, was swearing like a mad African in a New York nigger saloon, but it was the swearing of affection. The ridiculous oaths flew freely now that the cause of their obstruction was asleep. Presently he put his arm almost tenderly upon his comrade's shoulder, and they moved off together into the shadows where their tent stood faintly glimmering. Punk, too, a moment later followed their example, and disappeared between his odorous blankets in the opposite direction. Dr. Cathcart then likewise turned in, weariness and sleep still fighting in his mind with an obscure curiosity to know what it was that had scared Defago about the country up 50 Islands waterway. Wondering, too, why Punk's presence had prevented the completion of what Hank had to say. Then sleep overtook him. He would know tomorrow. Hank would tell him the story while they trudged after the elusive moose. Deep silence fell about the little camp, planted there so audaciously in the jaws of the wilderness. The lake gleamed like a sheet of black glass beneath the stars. The cold air pricked, and the draughts of night that poured their silent tide from the depths of the forest, with messages from distant ridges and from lakes just beginning to freeze. There lay already the faint bleak odours of coming winter. White men, with a dull scent, might never have divined them. The fragrance of the wood fire would have concealed from them these almost electrical hints of moss and bark and hardening swamp 100 miles away. Even Hank and Defago, subtly in league with the soul of the woods as they were, would probably have spread their delicate nostrils in vain. But an hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow. Silently, as only Indian blood can move, he raised his head and looked about him. The thick darkness rendered sight of small avail, but, like the animals, he possessed other senses that darkness could not mute. He listened, then sniffed the air. Motionless as a hemlock stem, he stood there. After 5 minutes again, he lifted his head and sniffed, and yet once again. A tingling of the wonderful nerves that betrayed itself by no outer sign ran through him as he tasted the keen air. Then, merging his figure into the surrounding blackness in a way that only wild men and animals understand, he turned, still moving like a shadow, and went stealthily back to his lean-to and his bed. And soon after he slept, the change of wind he had divined stirred gently the reflection of the stars within the lake. Rising among the far ridges of the country beyond 50 Island Water, it came from the direction in which he had stared, and it passed over the sleeping camp with a faint and sighing murmur through the tops of the trees that was almost too delicate to be audible. With it, down the desert paths of night, though too faint, too high even for the Indian's hair-like nerves, there passed a curious thin odour, strangely disquieting, an odour of something that seemed unfamiliar, utterly unknown. The French-Canadian and the man of Indian blood each stirred uneasily in his sleep just about this time, though neither of them woke. Then the ghost of that unforgettably strange odour passed away and was lost among the leagues of tenantless forest beyond.